Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Today we're reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita. We're in the chapter entitled Childhood, page 16. Abai turned 10 the same year the rails were laid for the electric tram on Harrison Road. He watched the workers lay the tracks, and when he first saw the trolley car's rod touching the overhead wire, it amazed him. He daydreamed of getting a stick, touching the wire himself, and running along by electricity. Does everyone know what a tram is? Do they still have them in India? Yeah. Still there in Calcutta? Oh, wonderful. Although electric power was new in Calcutta and not widespread, only the wealthy could afford it in their homes. Along with the electric tram came new electric street lights, carbon arc lamps, replacing the old gas lights. Abai and his friends used to go down the street looking on the ground for the old used carbon tips, which the maintenance man would leave behind. So when Prabhupada told this story about the tram and the gas lights, the devotees asked Prabhupada, well, what would you do with those carbon tips? He said, we would just play with them. We were children. And then he told him, with the next one. Okay. When Abai saw his first gramophone box, he thought an electric man or a ghost was inside the box singing. Abai liked to ride his bicycle down the busy Calcutta streets. Now, before this, because Abai's 10 years old, Abai, when he was very, very little, he used to have a tricycle. That's the 3 wheels that the little children ride. And he used to think, because he would see on his bicycle, he thought he had so much freedom on his tricycle. He said, I'm going to take this tricycle and I'm going to go to London. I'm going to go to the moon. He thought that his tricycle could take him anywhere. So he remembered that when he first went to London, because he remembered as a little child riding on his tricycle that I'm going to take my tricycle to London. He said, now here I am in London. After all these years, finally, I was able to come to London, because it's not, he was saying that it's not that just by imagination and by dreaming that you can reach where you want to go. No, it took so much hard struggle for him to finally reach London, not just by wishing on his tricycle. So Abai liked to ride his bicycle down the busy Calcutta streets. Although when the soccer club had been formed at school, he had requested the position of goalie so that he wouldn't have to run. He was an avid cyclist. A favorite ride was to go south towards Dalhousie Square, with its large fountain spraying water into the air. That was near Raj Bhavan, the Viceroy's mansion, which Abai could glimpse through the gates. Riding further south, he would pass through the open arches of the Maidan, Calcutta's main public park, with its beautiful green flat land spanning out towards Chourangi and the stately buildings and trees of the British Quarter. The park also had exciting places to cycle past: the racetrack, Fort William, the stadium. The Maidan bordered the Ganges, known locally as the Hooghly, and sometimes Abai would cycle home along its shores. Here he saw numerous bathing ghats with stone steps leading down into the Ganges, and often with temples at the top of the steps. There was the burning ghat, where bodies were cremated, and close to his home, a pontoon bridge that crossed the river into the city of Howrah. So really, Prabhupada's home was right in the center of where Calcutta was. On one side was the British quarter, on the other side was this beautiful Maidan, the park. And even Prabhupada, when he came back with his disciples, he would still take his morning walks there. Now, the Queen, of course, Prabhupada was born in 1896. And the Queen, Victoria, she died in 1901. And they decided, because she was also the Queen of India, she was the Queen of all of the British Commonwealth, they would make a beautiful memorial for her that would outshine the Taj Mahal. So they got all the marble from Makrana. They were going to make it pure white marble. And they enlisted one company, the Martin Company. And the Tekidar, the contractor, he was a Mr. Mukherjee, Rajendranath Mukherjee. It took him 20 years to make the memorial. And Prabhupada, because he would be riding on his bicycle and going there, a span of 20 years of his life watching this memorial being made, sometimes there was scaffolding. And he said, one time he climbed up the scaffolding and went all the way to the top of the Victoria Memorial. So when Brahmananda heard this, he was telling a few of the devotees, Brahmananda said, Prabhupada, you're so brave to climb that high. It's very high. So Prabhupada said, yes, I'm still brave. Otherwise, how could I go alone to a foreign country and preach Krishna consciousness like I did? I'm very brave. So, yes, he practiced his bravery even in his childhood. Okay. And then the Ganges, the Ganga River, the Hooghly, it's called Hooghly. So his father and he used to go for taking bath. They would walk just to save the 5 paisa on the tram. They would walk 10 kilometers. And to this day, there's still people in Calcutta, at least Prabhupada said so, that they take bath every day in the Hooghly. Even when Prabhupada was bathing there, there would be rubbish and stool. They would just push it away and take their bath. Because the Ganga is so pure that even if there's floating on the top, just as we read in the Upadeshamrita, even if there's bubbles and dirt on the top, the purity of the Ganga is such that if you bathe every day, you won't get disease. So Prabhupada used to go to these ghats with his father and bathe. And then temples. Maybe you've noticed that even if you look on a present-day map of Calcutta, there are no big Krishna temples there. Have you all noticed that? When you were a child there, did you ever visit a Krishna temple? No, they have a big Kali temple. But Krishna worship wasn't, even though it was Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Desh, they didn't worship Krishna there. So the biggest temple that you'll find on the map is our ISKCON temple. It's the most famous. Just like we have the most famous Rath Yatra, we have the most famous Krishna temple there. Because until Prabhupada brought Krishna consciousness back to India, even in Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's own country, they weren't worshiping Krishna. So Prabhupada did amazing things, and he wanted us to do something wonderful in Calcutta. So now the devotees are taking that up. They have his birthplace. They have the place where the Ultadanga Mutt, where Prabhupada first met Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. They're collecting all of these places where Prabhupada had his pastimes, so that when we go to Calcutta now, just like when we go here in Vrindavan, we visit all the tirthastans of Sri Krishna. So when we go to Calcutta, the plan is to have a whole Tirtha route, all these places where Prabhupada had his pastimes in Calcutta, because for the devotees, it's very inspiring how Prabhupada was able to come from this culture and spread Krishna consciousness all over the world. At age 12, though it made no deep impression on him, Abhay was initiated by a professional guru. Now, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, and the Vaishyas, they do the Upanayan Sanskar, and that is the taking of the Brahmin thread and the giving of the Gayatri mantra by a guru. Now, this was a Parivar guru. It was just the family guru who gave him his thread and the Gayatri mantra. And Prabhupada later rejected him because there was no real teaching. It was just a ritual for them. It was one of the sanskars that the upper classes would go through, just as they would go through the Jata Karma, the Namkaran, and all. So this is just something for the purification. Sanskar also means impression. So it gave an impression on Srila Prabhupada that now I'm accepting a guru, but he didn't accept the guru in the real sense. And later he rejected that guru and accepted Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. So the guru told him about his own master, a great yogi, who had once asked him, "What do you want to eat?" Abhay's family guru had replied, "Fresh pomegranates from Afghanistan." "All right," the yogi had replied, "go into the next room." And there he had found a branch of pomegranates, ripe as if freshly taken from the tree. So this is one of the mystic siddhis. The Prabhupada saw, because every day, without fail, Gaur Mahan, he would invite 4 to 5 sadhus to take prasadam at his house. And Gaur Mahan knew that many of them were not actually sadhus. And Prabhupada himself saw, it's just like every morning, everyone would go out to do their jobs, their work from their houses. So there was one man, he would put on his sannyas outfit every morning and go and beg. That was his profession. So Prabhupada saw all of this. He saw all these debauchees, he saw these charlatan sadhus. But still, Gaur Mahan was so charitable, and because it was the dharma to feed guests, he would make sure to feed 4 to 5 people every day. And his income was only 250 rupees a month. But now you multiply that by 10, by 20. Still he was feeding people. And Rajani, she was the Bhiksha Mata of several sadhus. Bhiksha Mata meant that they would come regularly and she would feed them every single day. So this was their culture. And Prabhupada also explains that even though the family, they weren't wealthy, but they always had enough. There was never any difficulty in their family. And what are the most important things? 3 things. That is, there's always something to eat, and there's always cloth to wear, and there's always a house, an ashray, a shelter. So they never had any want, even though Gaur Mahan was just a simple cloth merchant. And in those days, there was something called guinea gold. Guinea gold means pure gold. And you could take currency, you can buy all the gold you wanted, all the silver you wanted. So Rajani, she would take the mudra, she would take the regular currency, and they would say, "What do you want? You want gold, you want silver, you want currency?" And they would buy gold as much as they wanted. They would melt that gold down and make it into the ornaments for the weddings of her daughters, the 4 daughters. So there was never any want in the family. Gaur Mahan was easily able to marry all 4 of his daughters without any difficulty on just 250 rupees a month, because it was his responsibility. He did it because he knew that this was the Vedic way. You have to take care of your daughters. So Gormahan did not have a high opinion of Bengal's growing number. Oh, there's one part we missed. A yogi who came to see Abai's father said that he had once sat down with his own master and touched him, and had then been transported within moments to the city of Dwarka by yogic power. So there were some powerful yogis that Prabhupada had met and seen, but most of them he wasn't impressed by. Gormahan did not have a high opinion of Bengal's growing number of so-called sadhus, the non-devotional impersonalist philosophers, the demigod worshippers, the ganja smokers, the beggars. But he was so charitable that he would invite the charlatans into his home. Every day, Abai saw many so-called sadhus, as well as some who were genuine, coming to eat in his home as guests of his father. And from their words and activities, Abai became aware of many things, including the existence of yogic powers. At a circus, he and his father once saw a yogi tied up hand and foot and put into a bag. The bag was sealed and put into a box, which was then locked and sealed, but still the man came out. Abai, however, did not give these things much importance compared with the devotional activities his father had taught him, his worship of Radha Krishna and his observance of Rath Yatra. Prabhupada also talks about another yogi. He used to sit, he was a Nangi Baba, so he used to sit in meditation without any clothes on. And the British, they didn't like that, so they arrested him. They said, "You can't sit like this without clothes on." They arrested him and they put him into jail, but because he was a yogi, he just walked right out of the jail. And they couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't keep him locked up. Hindus and Muslims lived peacefully together in Calcutta, and it was not unusual for them to attend one another's social and religious functions. They had their differences, but there had always been harmony. So when trouble started, Abai's family understood it to be due to political agitation by the British. Abai was about 13 years old when the first Hindu-Muslim riot broke out. He did not exactly understand what it was, but somehow he found himself in the middle of it. So because before the British came, the Hindus, of course you have to remember that there was no such thing as Muslims in India before the Mughals came. The Hindus were forcibly converted because the poorer class, there was a Hindu tax. If you wanted to remain Hindu, you had to pay a tax to the Mughal government. So the poor people couldn't pay that tax. So the Muslims just sprinkled some water on them, and then they were rejected by the Muslim society, by the Hindu society, and they were forced to become Muslims. It was a very unfortunate situation. But they were all Hindu by culture. So there was no disharmony. There was no reason to fight. It was just unfortunate circumstances because the Mughals had come into the country by force. So what happened was when the British came and the Hindus started to realize that the British are taking over our whole country. We can't even live our own life now, our own culture. So what the British did was they would start a rumor. They would say, "Oh, the Muslim captured this woman and they took her away." So then the Hindus, they would go to find the woman, where is she, and they would attack the Muslims. And then they would start another rumor that the Hindus, they killed a Muslim and they dragged him away. So in that way, they started fights between the Hindu and the Muslim communities, where there were no fights before. They lived very peacefully together. And the Mullahs, although the Mullahs had their quarters, Harrison Road and everywhere where the Mullahs lived, all around them, was the Muslims. So this is what happened. Srila Prabhupada. All around our neighborhood on Harrison Road were Mohammedans. The Mullock house and our house were respectable. Otherwise, it was surrounded by what is called Kasbah and Basti. So the riot was there, and I had gone to play. I did not know that the riot had taken place in Market Square. Marcus Square is still there in Calcutta. I was coming home, and one of my class friends said, "Don't go to your house. That side is rioting now." We lived in the Mohammedan quarter, and the fighting between the two parties was going on. But I thought maybe it was something like two gundas fighting. I had seen one gunda once stabbing another gunda, and I had seen pickpockets. They were our neighborhood men. So I thought it was like that. This is going on. He had never seen a riot before. But when I came to the crossing of Harrison Road and Holiday Street, I saw one shop being plundered. I was only a child, a boy. I thought, what is this happening? In the meantime, my family, my father and mother, were at home frightened, thinking, the child has not come. They became so disturbed, they came out of the home expecting, where from the child will come. So what could I do? When I saw the rioting, I began to run towards our house. And one Mohammedan, he wanted to kill me. He took his knife and actually ran after me. Well, actually, what Prabhupada said is he took his lati. But in English, they don't know what a lati was, so they wrote knife. Okay? He ran after me, but I passed somehow or other. I was saved. So as I came running before our gate, my parents got their life back. So without speaking anything, I went to the bedroom, and it was in the winter. So without saying anything, I laid down, wrapped myself with the quilt. Then later I was rising from bed, questioning, is it ended? The riot has ended? So this is a great traumatic experience for Prabhupada because he never saw such things before in his life. And this was all part of the tension that was created by the British, because if the Indians themselves are fighting, then they won't notice that that they won't fight with the British then. So it was all politics. When Abai was 15, he was afflicted with beriberi, and his mother, who was also stricken, regularly, beriberi is when the legs become too weak to move, regularly had to rub a powder of calcium chloride on his legs to reduce the swelling. Abai soon recovered, and his mother, who had never stopped any of her duties, also recovered. But only a year later, at the age of 46, his mother suddenly died. Her passing away was an abrupt lowering of the curtain, ending the scenes of his tender childhood. His mother's affectionate care, her prayers and mantras for his protection, her feeding and grooming him, her dutifully scolding him. Her passing affected his sisters even more than him, though it certainly turned him more towards the affectionate care of his father. He was already 16, but now he was forced to grow up and prepare to enter on his own into worldly responsibilities. Now here it says that he was 16, but when Prabhupada remembers this, he said he was only 14. And this had such an impression on Srila Prabhupada when his mother died, because his mother, we read in his childhood how she would, they were of the same spirit. they were always locking horns together. Sometimes even Prabhupada, he would want to leave his house because his mother wouldn't do exactly what he wanted her to do. So when his mother died, it was such a shock to him. He realized that now I am free. I don't have my mother to look after me, to stop me. But that type of freedom was means free to move on in life. And having the loss of his mother, he realized then he had his dear father who was so loving to him, always thought of him first, being the first son. And he took then more and more shelter of his father because he didn't have his mother anymore who looked after him the most. She was the strict one of the two. His father gave him solace. He instructed Abai that there was nothing for which to lament. The soul is eternal, and everything happens by the will of Krishna. So he should have faith and depend upon Krishna. Abai listened and understood. So Prabhupada also remembers that actually he was brought up by his elder sisters, because having the loss of his mother then, his sisters had to give him shelter. Now we're entering into chapter 2. This is called College, Marriage, and Gandhi's Movement. And there's a quotation here by Srila Prabhupada. I joined Gandhi's movement in 1920 and gave up my education. Although I had passed my final examination, BA, I gave it up and did not appear. So he even took the exam. But because Gandhi, he was trying to encourage the Indians that don't be the slaves of the Britishers. They will give you just enough education so that you can do their work. The whole educational system was to create servants of the British. That was all that they taught. They didn't teach the Indian culture. They didn't teach anything about the Vedas. They considered the Vedas to be barbarian. They had mandatory Bible study in every single day they had to do Bible study. So they were trying to indoctrinate. Yes, they made schools, they made educations, but there was a purpose for it. And that purpose was to completely erase the Vedic system of education and culture and to give Christian education. And at the time of graduation, they would be qualified just to do the work that the British needed them to do. For instance, they needed clerks. So they would teach them typing and writing and all the things they needed just to be a clerk. And when they made the railway systems, they wouldn't give the British any of the higher commissioned jobs. The only thing the British could do was be mechanics in the trains. So they had a plan. They were using the people of that country to do their work. And in that way, they were able to rule the people by the people themselves. The soldiers were Indians. The policemen were Indians. There were how many British were here? Not many British could come here. So they trained all the Indians to keep control of the other Indian people. This was a very big plan, and it was all masterminded by the leaders who had come here as the viceroys and the people being sent from in England to rule India. In 1914, the war came, and this is the First World War. And many Indians enlisted in the fight on behalf of their ruler, Great Britain. Now, this First World War was between Germany and the other countries in Europe. It was all about land. It was an economic war because Germany wanted to expand. Just like now Russia is always trying to expand, like what's going on in Ukraine. So Germany, they wanted to take over other countries so that they could have more economic wealth. So they started attacking different countries, and the Europeans had to contain the Germans. It was all based on money and wealth. So because the Indians were part of the Commonwealth of England, they also joined in this war. Abai saw British airplanes landing on the racetrack in Maidan Park. That was where Fort Williams was. And the newspaper told him of the war, but he was not directly affected. It didn't reach India, the war. The war was all in Europe. In 1916, he began college. There were two prestigious colleges in Calcutta: Presidency, which is a purely British government college, and Scottish Churches. Now, Scottish Churches College, that was run by the church. The professors were fathers. They were all priests who had taken their vows. They didn't marry. They were here to indoctrinate the students with Christianity. But the most amazing thing was the Hindu students didn't become Christians. Just like nobody ever became a Muslim by choice, they also didn't become Christians. They were going to the school to get an education, but they weren't pulled away from their Vedic culture. Some of them became Christians purely for professional reasons. They became Christians because then they would be treated better in the college. They could become professors, or they can get better jobs. There was one Professor Roy. He became a Christian because then he could get a better position in the college, and he refused to speak Bengali. He would only speak English. But it had nothing to do with religion. It was all about economics and social status. Religion, there's only one God. But because the British wanted to kick out the Vedic culture, so they gave this Christian education in their schools. Abai entered Scottish Churches College. It was a Christian school, but well reputed amongst the Bengalis, and many Vaishnav families sent their sons there. The professors, most of whom were priests in the Church of Scotland, were known as sober, moral men, and the students received a good education. It was a proper and respectable institution, and since it was in North Calcutta and not far from Harrison Road, Gormahan could keep Abai at home. There were other students there who had to be boarders, they had to stay at the college, but Abai was able to cycle to the school every day, so that way Gormahan was able to keep him in the house. Gormahan had long ago decided that he would not allow Abai to go to London in the name of education, and in the name of education become exposed to the corruption of the West. He wanted Abai to be a pure devotee of Srimati Radharani and Lord Krishna. Yet on the other hand, Gormahan didn't want to give up his son to become the brahmachari disciple of a guru. This is Varnashram. We have the four Varnas, and Gormahan, he was a Vaishya. And the Vaishyas, for some time, they might study in the house of the guru, in the Gurukula. But then they go back to their homes, they get married, and they learn the Vaishya trade of their father. So Gormahan, he gave Abai wonderful training in his childhood of Vaishnav culture, but he had no plans for his son to become a brahmachari. He wanted him to become a professional and get married. Where was such a qualified guru to be found? His experience of yogis and swamis had not inspired such confidence. He wanted his son to keep all the principles of spiritual life, yet he also knew that Abai would have to marry and earn a livelihood. Under the circumstances, enrolling Abai in Scottish Churches College was the most protection Gormahan knew to give his son. So I'm not from England, but when Prabhupada first came back to India, because it was just soon after the liberation of when India got independence. So at that time, there was still an agreement that anyone who was a part of the British Commonwealth would be allowed to live without visas, without any restrictions in India. They had that agreement. So Prabhupada wanted his British and Commonwealth disciples to come here to serve in India. Our first two temple presidents, one of them was Scottish, that was Dhananjaya, and the other one was from New Zealand, Akshayananda Swami. New Zealand, Australia, Scotland, Wales, they're all a part of the British Commonwealth. So many of the devotees who came to serve here, Gunarnava, he was from Wales, Smartahari, I think he's also from Wales. They were all British Commonwealth citizens, so they could live here for the rest of their life. It didn't matter. Devotees from Canada came here. The devotee who was in charge of our Goshala, he was from Canada, Drupada, because they didn't have to leave. And we Americans, because America is like India, we had a big revolution, we kicked out the British, so we had to get visas. So we were always getting kicked out of the country, but the British could stay. So there was one disciple from Scotland, and that was Dhananjaya. And these Scottish priests, they were sent all over India to make Christians, to convert the Indians into Christians. And one place that they concentrated on was Manipur. Now, we know that Manipur was the purest of Vaishnav kingdoms. The king was a Vaishnava. He had all of the people worship Radha Govinda. He had temples all over his country. It was pure Vaishnava. But the Scottish entered Manipur and started converting people. And Prabhupada knew this because he was connected with the Scottish church and what they were doing. So when Dhananjaya came here, and Prabhupada specifically assigned him to be the temple president as being Scottish, he told Dhananjaya that not only do I want you to be president here in Vrindavan, but I want you to go to Manipur because you're Scottish. And it was you, Scottish, who destroyed the culture in Manipur. And I want you to make everyone into Vaishnavas again. So every once in a while, Dhananjaya would go to Manipur for preaching. It was as if Prabhupada had blamed Dhananjaya for what all the Scottish priests had done. And now Dhananjaya had to undo it all. Okay. The college had been founded by the Reverend Alexander Duff, a Christian missionary who had gone to Calcutta in 1830. Now, don't fool yourselves. Now we have Mother Teresa, who they've made into a saint. But any time they interviewed Mother Teresa, she very clearly said, I have come to India for missionary work. She did not come to help the Indians. She did not come to help the poor. She came to convert the Indians to Christianity. And the way she did this was by going to the poorest people who had no shelter and turning them into Christians. So this missionary spirit, don't think that they've come to do charity on behalf of the Indians. It's not like that at all. They come to turn the Indians into Christians. And even just before the British left, they made an agreement with the new government coming in that no one could touch the churches. To this day, although so many of the big temples have come under the Indian government, they'd never touch the churches. You'll never hear that the churches have come under the Indian government. The churches are all independent of the government. That's because of the agreement that the British made. And it's all a secret trick. I'm sorry to say. I mean, we should understand these things because this is what we're dealing with having to preach in India. How the missionaries are simply trying to break the Vedic culture. And this is why Prabhupada wanted the foreigners, because we come from, some of us come from Christian background, to show that we accept the Vedic culture. This is your culture, so you should accept it again and not become Christians. So this was all a trick by the British. Just like, why did they cut up India into Pakistan and India? Simply to break the culture, nothing else. So when they left a big mess. And Prabhupada, he once told us that when the British left, because even in Prabhupada's school, we'll read later, the teachers used to tell them that you Indians, you'll never get independence because you're not even qualified to run your own country. That's why we have to run it for you. So, but some of the Indians also believed that. So after they got independence and they had their elections, some of the Indians would say, "Can we vote for the English?" Because they didn't trust their own people that they could run the country. A pioneer in getting Indians to appreciate European civilization, the Reverend A. Duff had first founded the General Assembly Institution for propagation of the gospel. Gospel means Christianity, through education, at once liberal and religious, on Western principles, and with English as the medium of instruction in the higher classes. So actually this turned out to be a great benefit for Srila Prabhupada, because he went to the Christian school, the Christian college, the church college, and he was forced to learn the Bible. He already knew the Christian philosophy, and he knew the weaknesses of the Christian philosophy that way. So that way, he was very capable of preaching Krishna consciousness to Christians, because he was able to maintain his own Krishna consciousness even while getting a Christian education. This was all Krishna's arrangement for him, that he got this education. So the real purpose of setting up these colleges was to preach the gospel. That means Christianity through the education. Okay. Later, he had founded the College of the Church of Scotland, and in 1908 had amalgamated both institutions as Scottish Churches College. Srila Prabhupada says, "We respected our professors as our fathers. They were very good, respectable, religious men. The relationship between the students and the professors was very good. The Vice Chancellor, Professor W.S. Urquhart, was a perfect and kind-hearted gentleman with whom we sometimes joked." So Prabhupada speaks, he remembers very fondly his professors. But the principal was such a rough man. Prabhupada said that he used to fight with the students like a gunda. But he was an excellent manager, so they even respected him. But his philosophy teacher, his English teacher, his science teachers, they had the greatest respect for these teachers. And they didn't bring religion into the classroom. They simply taught the subjects, and the students looked up to these teachers. Prabhupada said that they had sadhu-like qualities. In my first year, I studied English and Sanskrit. Prabhupada was first in Sanskrit always. In my second year, Sanskrit and philosophy. Then philosophy and economics. Another professor was J.C. Scrimergor. He was professor of English literature. While teaching English literature, he would give parallel passages from Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. You've all heard of Bankim Chandra? Yes, yes, he would say, your Bankim Baba says like this. He had studied Bankim's literatures, and he compared Bankim Chandra Chatterjee to Walter Scott. In those days, Dickens and Sir Walter Scott were two very great English literary men. So he taught us those novelists, and the relationship was very nice. So it was just amazing how Krishna prepared Prabhupada for preaching in the West. He gave him an excellent English background, so that Prabhupada knew all of the great authors. He knew the philosophy of Christianity. And in this way, very easily, Prabhupada was able to speak to the Westerners and convince them that you just try this Vedic system because God is one. It's not a question of faith. I can become a Christian one day, a Muslim another day, a Hindu the next day. No, God is the same in every single religion, because this is what Prabhupada realized by studying both Christianity and his own Vedic culture. Abai became a member of the English Society and would recite Keats, Shelley, and other poets to his classmates. As a member of the Sanskrit Society, he recited the Gita, Bhagavad Gita, and some of his fellow students especially noted how eloquently he recited the 11th chapter, describing the universal form of Krishna. He also played soccer and took part in theatrics. So when Srila Prabhupada began his translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam, he was already a Sanskrit scholar. And the books that he studied from were written in Bengali. Those books, one of the books we have in Prabhupada's house, it's a big book like this that has Srimad Bhagavatam written in Bengali. Because in the Bengali texts, the different tikas, the different commentaries were given of the acharyas. So these commentaries were available because Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati printed these books. And therefore, although Prabhupada knew the Sanskrit, he knew how to translate. He always referred to the tikas when he did his translation. And by reading those tikas, Prabhupada created his own Bhaktivedanta purports. This takes such genius that Prabhupada could, all this studying that he did, although he didn't even accept his bachelor's degree, this all prepared him for what his spiritual master wanted him to do by preaching in the West. Amrit Lal Bose, a famous organizer and director of theater in Bengal, rehearsed Abai and a group of his classmates in a drama from the life of Lord Chaitanya. Since Chaitanya Leela was available in the public theater for half a rupee, many people performed Chaitanya Leela in Bengal. Mr. Bose argued, what was the need for an amateur production, because these were all just college students? And his answer was, they should appreciate your performance of Lord Chaitanya so much that after seeing it, they will agree never to sin. So Amrit Lal Bose, he had a purpose for teaching these students. He wanted them to become so pure in their dramatics that the parts that they played would convince the people to take up Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's teachings. And Prabhupada went into great, it's not that much described here, but for 2 years they studied. And because some of the students would be absent while they were rehearsing, each of them learned everybody else's roles, their parts, so that they could all replace each other. And they were so perfect. Now, Mr. Bose, He wasn't ready to allow them to perform, but the students begged him. They finally convinced him. The eminent director was volunteering his service and training these boys, but on one condition: they would not perform publicly unless he said the production was perfect. For more than a year, Abai and the others rehearsed the Chaitanya play until finally their director allowed them to stage a public performance. Abai, playing the part of Advaita Acharya, noticed that many people in the audience were crying. At first he could not understand why, but then he realized that because the players had been well trained and because they were sincere, the audience was moved. That was Abai's first and last dramatic performance. So that's the difference between a performance done by just professional actors and a performance done by those who are sincere and who understand the characters. So because the young men in this dramatic performance, they had been trained so perfectly, they weren't just doing it as a profession, they were doing it as a form of devotion. And therefore the audience was affected by that, and it even brought tears to their eyes. Abai's psychology teacher, Professor Urquhart, gave evidence that woman's brain weighed less than man's. His economics professor lectured on Marshall's theory that family affection is the impetus for economic development. That theory is also supported within the Srimad Bhagavatam. That, in fact, even now, companies, they prefer to hire family men, because if a man is unmarried, he doesn't have any impetus to progress in his ambitious pursuit of getting better and better in his profession. So this family impetus is very important for economic development, because if you have a family, you have to maintain them. It means you want to do better and better and get a better job always and always improve. So that's not in the heart of a single man, because he doesn't have any reason, no purpose. There's one devotee here. He was working in the UAE. Unfortunately, he was working in catering, and they did a lot of non-veg catering. It was before he became a devotee. And then he met the devotees. He was unmarried, had a big job, everything very nice in the UAE, making a lot of money. But then he met the devotees, and his Guru Maharaj asked him, he said, "You're not married. Why do you have to work? What do you need money for?" And then he realized, I don't have to work anymore. So he came here to live in Vrindavan. He's still here. Krishna Kishore Prabhu. So without the family impetus, we don't care about making economic gain, because we don't have a family to maintain. In Sanskrit, Abai used a text by Rowe and Webb that describes Sanskrit as the mother of all languages. While studying Kalidasa's Kumar Sambhava in Sanskrit, Abai was impressed by Kalidasa's explanation of the word dhira, which means undisturbed or self-controlled. According to Kalidas, once long ago, Lord Shiva was sitting in deep meditation. Because the demigods were at war with the demons, they wanted a commander-in-chief born from the semen of Lord Shiva. So the demigods sent a beautiful young girl, Parvati, to interrupt his meditation. Although Parvati worshipped Lord Shiva and even touched his genitals, he was not disturbed. His resistance to temptation was the perfect example of being dhira. So, of course, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, we learn about all these pastimes. But at the time, because Prabhupada was in a college, he was learning from Kalidas about the meaning of the word dhira. Later, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, 3rd canto, 4th canto, when we read about the pastimes of Lord Shiva, we can understand more clearly why all of this happened, who Parvati actually was. It was Sati who had taken birth again as Parvati, and it was a continuation of their pastimes. But at this time, because Prabhupada had not done the in-depth study, he was still in his college, he got inspiration from Kalidas's works. As at other British-run schools in India, all the European teachers at Scottish churches had to learn the local language. Once Professor Urquhart walked past Abai and a group of students as they were eating some peanuts and talking together. One of the students, speaking in Bengali, made a joke at Professor Urquhart's expense. To their surprise, Professor Urquhart immediately turned to the jokester and answered in Bengali, and Abai and the others felt ashamed. Okay, we'll end here now. Hare Krishna. Jai.